Life, when we realize that not every wound is loud and not every pain is visible. Some people enter our lives like mirrors, reflecting back pieces of us we never questioned, and then slowly distort that reflection until we begin to doubt our own light. And in that quiet confusion, we give away pieces of our peace, thinking we are building love. But there comes a sacred turning point when you stop trying to win understanding from those committed to misunderstanding you, and you begin to return home to yourself. This is not a story of revenge nor of bitterness, but of awakening. It is the moment you discover that your silence can be stronger than their noise, and your healing can speak louder than their control. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from work nor from struggle, but from constantly trying to explain your heart to someone who has already decided not to hear it. You speak carefully, you choose your words gently, you revisit conversations in your mind at midnight, wondering if perhaps you could have said it differently, softer, clearer, kinder. But the truth is, some people do not misunderstand you because you failed to communicate. They misunderstand you because your confusion gives them power, and your constant need to be understood keeps you emotionally chained to their approval. And one day, something inside you begins to awaken. You realize that peace cannot grow in a place where you are forever defending your intentions. There is power in silence that wounded people rarely recognize at first. Silence is not weakness. It is not defeat. It is the sacred moment when you decide your soul deserves rest from unnecessary battles. When you stop arguing with someone determined to twist your truth, you begin protecting parts of yourself that have been bleeding for far too long. You no longer rush to correct every accusation. You no longer tremble under the pressure of proving your goodness. Instead, you stand still inside your own knowing, and that stillness becomes unshakable. A narcissistic soul often feeds on reaction. They study your emotions like instruments they can play whenever they crave attention, control, or reassurance. They expect your tears, your explanations, your desperate attempts to fix what they deliberately broke. But when you become silent, not cold, not cruel, but deeply centered, they begin to lose access to the version of you they once manipulated so easily. Your silence removes the stage on which their power performed. It denies chaos the audience it once relied upon. And perhaps the hardest lesson of all is understanding that closure does not always arrive through conversation. Sometimes closure arrives the day you stop asking someone to validate your pain. Sometimes healing begins when you finally accept that people who benefit from hurting you will rarely confess to the damage they caused. That truth may ache at first because the human heart naturally longs to be seen, acknowledged, understood. But there is freedom in no longer waiting for accountability from those who built their comfort upon your suffering. You begin to change quietly. Your energy becomes more guarded, more intentional. You stop explaining your boundaries to people who only see boundaries as obstacles to control. You stop shrinking your voice to avoid conflict and stop overextending your kindness to earn temporary affection. And in that transformation, something beautiful happens. You begin hearing yourself again. Beneath all the noise they created, beneath all the guilt and emotional confusion, your inner voice was still there, patiently waiting for your return. The greatest victory is not making them hurt the way you hurt. The greatest victory is becoming unreachable to the version of yourself that once believed love required self-abandonment. It is waking up one morning and realizing that their opinion no longer controls your worth. It is laughing again without guilt, breathing again without fear, living again without constantly preparing for emotional war. And when that day comes, your silence will no longer feel empty. It will feel like freedom. There comes a painful season in life when you keep returning to the same door, hoping this time it will open differently. You replay conversations in your mind, searching for the missing sentence, the missing apology, the missing moment where they finally look into your eyes and admit the hurt they caused. You wait for understanding, like a thirsty soul waits for rain. And because your heart is sincere, you believe sincerity must eventually awaken sincerity in them. But some people are not confused about the pain they create. They are simply comfortable living above the wreckage of other people's emotions. And the longer you beg clarity from those who survive through emotional chaos, the longer you postpone your own healing. There is a dangerous habit many wounded people develop. They believe closure is something another person must hand them, like a final gift before peace can begin. So they continue the conversation long after it has already destroyed them. They ask more questions. They seek deeper explanations. They reopen wounds, hoping honesty will finally appear. But closure rarely comes from people who benefited from your confusion. In fact, confusion was often the very thing that kept you emotionally attached to them. As long as you questioned yourself, you remained easier to control. And that realization can feel heartbreaking at first, because healthy hearts naturally crave resolution. Human beings want meaning behind suffering. We want truth to sit down beside us and explain why we were loved one day and discarded the next, why our loyalty was met with manipulation, why our compassion became a tool used against us. But not every story ends with accountability. Not every person possesses the emotional depth required to face the damage they caused. Some people avoid truth because truth threatens the image they have carefully built around themselves. So healing begins the moment you stop chasing answers from those committed to keeping you emotionally dizzy. Healing begins when you understand that every conversation does not deserve continuation. Every wound does not require mutual understanding before it can close. Sometimes peace arrives quietly, the moment you decide your mental and emotional well-being matters more than one final explanation. You stop trying to untangle every contradiction they left behind. You stop exhausting your spirit searching for logic inside behavior rooted in selfishness. And little by little, you reclaim your energy. The sleepless nights become fewer. The emotional heaviness begins to loosen its grip. You discover that closure is not always an external event. Sometimes closure is internal acceptance. It is the decision to stop drinking from empty wells. There is strength in walking away without all the answers. There is maturity in admitting that some people will never fully reveal themselves because deception protects their comfort. And when you finally release the need for them to confess, apologize, or validate your pain, something extraordinary happens. Their power over your emotions begins to fade. Your peace no longer depends on their honesty. Your healing no longer waits for their permission. You begin creating a life untouched by their chaos, a life where your spirit is no longer held hostage by unresolved conversations. And eventually, you realize the closure you searched for was never hidden inside their words. It was waiting inside your decision to let go. There is something deeply painful about being seen through the eyes of someone who only notices your value when it benefits them. Little by little, their words begin shaping the way you see yourself. They call you too sensitive when you express hurt. They call you difficult when you ask for respect. They call you selfish when you finally begin protecting your peace. And after hearing these things long enough, you begin carrying labels that never truly belong to you. You start apologizing for emotions that were completely human. You shrink parts of your personality just to avoid conflict. You become quieter, smaller, more cautious, hoping that if you change enough, the love you long for will finally feel safe. But there comes a moment in every healing journey when your soul grows tired of wearing identities built from someone else's manipulation. A quiet awakening begins inside you. You start realizing that many of the things they accused you of were reflections of their own fears, insecurities, and need for control. The problem was never your kindness. The problem was that your kindness became easy to exploit. The problem was never your voice. The problem was that your voice threatened the version of reality they wanted to maintain. And so you begin the difficult work of separating who you truly are from who they convinced you to believe you were. At first, this feels unfamiliar. When a person has spent so much time questioning your worth, self-trust does not return overnight. You may still hear their criticism echoing in quiet moments. You may still hesitate before speaking honestly, fearing rejection or punishment. But healing is not the absence of scars. Healing is learning that scars do not define your identity. You begin remembering yourself in pieces, in the laughter you once silenced, in the dreams you postponed, in the confidence you abandoned to keep someone else comfortable. Slowly, you reconnect with the version of yourself that existed before fear took up permanent residence in your spirit. And that reconnection is powerful, because narcissistic control often depends on convincing you that you cannot survive without their approval. The moment you rediscover your own voice, their illusion begins to collapse. There is freedom in realizing that their descriptions of you were never absolute truth. You were not too emotional. You were emotionally honest in an environment that punished honesty. You were not hard to love. You simply asked for consistency from people committed to inconsistency. You were not weak for caring deeply. In fact, your ability to love despite disappointment reveals a strength many people will never possess. As your identity returns, so does your peace. You stop measuring your worth by how well you can tolerate disrespect. You stop viewing self-sacrifice as proof of love. You stop chasing validation from people who only valued you when you abandoned yourself. And perhaps most importantly, you stop introducing yourself to the world through the wounds they gave you, because you are not the insults spoken during their anger. You are not the distorted image they created when they feared losing control over you. You are not the confusion they planted inside your mind. You are a human being still worthy of tenderness, dignity, and truth. And the most beautiful part of healing is this: the more clearly you see yourself, the less power their projections hold over your life. There was a time when every word they spoke could change the atmosphere of your entire day. A delayed message could fill your chest with anxiety. A cold tone could make you question your worth. Their approval felt like sunlight, and their rejection felt like punishment. Without realizing it, you began living emotionally connected to their moods, their attention, and their unpredictable behavior. And this is how manipulation quietly grows, not always through shouting or cruelty, but through emotional conditioning that teaches you to abandon your own stability in order to manage someone else's chaos. The narcissistic mind often studies reactions more than feelings. They notice what hurts you, what frightens you, what keeps you chasing reassurance, and once they discover those emotional doors, they return to them repeatedly, not because they seek connection, but because reaction gives them a sense of control. Your tears become proof that they still occupy space in your mind. Your anger becomes confirmation that they can still disturb your peace. Even your desperate attempts to fix the relationship can feed the belief that your emotional world still revolves around them. But healing begins when you recognize that not every attack deserves a response. Not every insult deserves your defense. Not every misunderstanding deserves your emotional exhaustion. There is a powerful shift that happens when you stop reacting from wounded instinct and begin responding from inner clarity. At first, this silence feels unnatural. You may feel guilty for no longer explaining yourself. You may feel weak for walking away from arguments you once fought desperately to win. But over time, you begin to understand that peace is not found in proving yourself to difficult people. Peace is found in no longer needing their validation to feel whole. Stillness is not emptiness. It is emotional discipline. It is the decision to protect your spirit from becoming a battlefield every time someone demands access to your emotions. And when a narcissistic person realizes they can no longer easily provoke you, something changes in the dynamic. The hooks that once pulled immediate reactions begin losing their grip. The guilt no longer controls you the same way. The manipulation becomes easier to recognize. Their words may still reach your ears, but they stop reaching the deepest parts of your self-worth. This does not mean you become cold or emotionless. It means you become centered, There is a difference. You no longer hand your emotional balance to people who misuse it. You no longer collapse every time someone refuses to understand you. Instead, you observe more carefully. You protect your energy more intentionally. You begin choosing calm over chaos, even when chaos once felt familiar. And perhaps one of the greatest forms of growth is learning that your reaction is valuable, your attention is valuable, your emotional energy is sacred. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to it simply because they demand it. Some people lose influence over you the moment you stop feeding every conflict with your participation. The truth is, silence unsettles those who depended on controlling your emotions. Your calmness becomes a mirror reflecting the loss of their influence. They may push harder at first. They may test old wounds, revisit old tactics, or provoke old fears, hoping to awaken the version of you that once reacted instantly. But if you remain grounded, if you remain connected to your own peace, eventually you will notice something extraordinary. The storm that once lived inside you begins to quiet, and in that quiet, you finally hear yourself again. One of the greatest misunderstandings about healing is the belief that forgiveness requires reunion. Many people stay emotionally trapped because they think letting go means reopening the door to those who wounded them. They believe peace demands another conversation, another chance, another sacrifice of self. But true forgiveness does not ask you to return to the place that broke you. It does not demand access for people who repeatedly turned your kindness into a place of injury. Forgiveness is not an invitation for harm to continue. It is the decision to stop carrying poison in your own spirit. For a long time, you may resist forgiveness because the pain feels too deep. Part of you fears that releasing anger will somehow excuse what happened. You worry that if you stop hurting, then the damage they caused will appear smaller than it truly was. But forgiveness is not pretending the wound never existed. It is acknowledging the wound honestly while refusing to let it define the rest of your life. It is saying, "What happened to me mattered, but I will not allow it to imprison my future." There is a difference between forgiving someone and trusting them again. Trust is earned through consistency, accountability, and change. Forgiveness, however, is deeply personal. It is an internal release. Some people confuse compassion with self-betrayal. They continue allowing disrespect because they want to appear understanding, patient, loving. But there is nothing loving about abandoning yourself to protect someone else's comfort. Wisdom teaches you that boundaries are not bitterness. Distance is not cruelty. Sometimes the healthiest love you can offer yourself is refusing to reopen doors that only lead back to suffering. And perhaps the hardest part is accepting that some people will never fully understand the pain they caused you. They may minimize it, deny it, rewrite history to protect their own image. They may continue living as though your heartbreak was insignificant. That reality can feel deeply unfair. But healing begins when you stop waiting for guilty hearts to suddenly become honest ones. Your freedom cannot depend on another person's awakening. Otherwise, your peace remains permanently tied to someone who may never choose accountability. So you begin releasing things quietly. You release the fantasy that one perfect conversation would change everything. You release the hope that they will someday become the person you needed them to be. You release the habit of revisiting old wounds, searching for explanations that may never come. And though this release feels painful at first, it eventually creates space inside you where peace can finally breathe again. Forgiveness is not weakness. In many ways, it is one of the strongest things a human being can do. Because resentment can become addictive, pain can become an identity, anger can begin shaping the way you see the world. But forgiveness interrupts that cycle. It allows you to carry the lesson without carrying the constant emotional weight. It allows you to remember without remaining emotionally chained to the memory. And as you heal, you begin to understand something beautiful. Letting go does not erase your strength, it reveals it. You no longer need revenge to feel powerful. You no longer need their apology to validate your pain. You no longer need reconciliation to prove your worth. Sometimes closure is simply this: walking away with your heart intact, your boundaries respected, and your spirit finally light enough to move forward without looking back. There is a painful truth many people discover too late. Not every relationship survives on love alone. Some survive on attention, sacrifice, emotional labor, and the quiet habit of one person constantly abandoning themselves to keep another person comfortable. In the beginning, you may have mistaken this exhaustion for devotion. You answered every call, softened every conflict, excused every disrespect, and carried the emotional weight of the relationship as though it were your responsibility alone. You believed that if you loved harder, understood deeper, or gave more of yourself, eventually the relationship would become balanced. But slowly, almost invisibly, what felt like love began draining the life out of you. You stopped noticing your own needs because you became consumed by managing theirs. Their moods determined the atmosphere of your day. Their approval became your emotional reward. Their disappointment became your personal failure. And somewhere in the middle of constantly trying to keep peace, you lost connection with your own inner peace entirely. This is the dangerous thing about emotional depletion. It often disguises itself as loyalty. You wear your exhaustion proudly, believing endurance proves the depth of your love, while your spirit quietly weakens beneath the pressure of never being fully poured into in return. A narcissistic person often survives through emotional consumption. They seek admiration, reassurance, attention, control, and validation, not as occasional needs, but as constant emotional fuel. And compassionate people frequently become the source of that fuel because they naturally give, nurture, and empathize deeply. But giving without reciprocity eventually becomes self-erasure. The relationship begins revolving around preserving one person's ego while slowly dismantling the other person's emotional stability. The awakening begins when you finally notice how tired you have become. Not physically tired, but soul tired. Tired of over-explaining, tired of apologizing for things that were never your fault. Tired of carrying conversations alone, tired of shrinking your emotions to avoid conflict, tired of constantly pouring energy into someone who only notices your value when you are useful to them. And that exhaustion becomes sacred because sometimes people do not change when they are hurt. Sometimes they change when they become tired of hurting. So you begin withdrawing your energy carefully, quietly, intentionally, not from cruelty, but from self-respect. You stop overextending yourself to earn affection that should have been freely given. You stop chasing people who repeatedly make you feel unwanted. You stop volunteering your peace to fix problems you did not create. And as you reclaim your energy, the relationship dynamic begins to shift. The access they once had to your emotions no longer feels unlimited. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. You may feel guilty for no longer giving endlessly. People who benefited from your self-neglect may call you distant, selfish, cold, or changed. But what they often mourn is not your absence. They mourn the loss of unrestricted access to your emotional labor. They notice the difference because your energy once sustained patterns that no longer survive without your participation. And slowly you begin to understand that love should not leave you emotionally starving. Healthy love does not demand the destruction of your identity. It does not require you to constantly betray your own needs to preserve someone else's ego. Real love allows you to breathe, to rest, to exist fully as yourself without fear of punishment or emotional manipulation. The moment you stop feeding unhealthy dynamics with your endless energy is the moment your healing truly begins. Because your spirit was never meant to survive on depletion. It was meant to live in peace. There is a quiet kind of healing that happens far away from the eyes of those who hurt you. It does not arrive with loud announcements or dramatic moments of revenge. It begins in small, sacred spaces, the mornings where you finally breathe without fear, the nights where your thoughts no longer revolve around surviving someone else's behavior, the moments where you slowly remember who you were before pain convinced you to disappear. And perhaps the most beautiful part of recovery is realizing that there are places within you they never truly touched. Beneath the confusion, beneath the manipulation, beneath the emotional exhaustion, your soul still carried untouched pieces of truth waiting patiently for your return. For a long time, you may have believed they had completely broken you. Their words echoed in your mind. Their criticism shaped your self-image. Their approval felt necessary for your confidence to survive. And because emotional manipulation often works slowly, you did not immediately notice how much of yourself you were surrendering just to maintain connection. Little by little, you abandoned your instincts, your boundaries, your joy, your voice. You became so focused on preserving the relationship that you stopped preserving your own spirit. But people can only control the parts of you that you hand over in fear. There are deeper rooms inside every human being that manipulation cannot permanently occupy unless you stop believing those rooms belong to you. And one day, after enough disappointment, enough heartbreak, enough emotional emptiness, you begin returning to those inner spaces. At first, the journey feels unfamiliar. You have spent so long prioritizing someone else's needs that reconnecting with yourself almost feels uncomfortable. Silence feels strange. Peace feels undeserved. Rest feels unnatural. But healing slowly teaches your nervous system that safety is no longer something you must beg for. You begin rebuilding yourself quietly, not for attention, not to prove anything to the person who hurt you, but because your soul becomes hungry for honesty again. You rediscover simple things that once brought you peace, music that softens your thoughts, conversations that do not leave you emotionally drained, moments of solitude that no longer feel lonely, but restorative. You start protecting your energy instead of constantly offering it to people who misuse it. And with every boundary you honor, another piece of your self-worth returns. There is something powerful about becoming whole in private. Narcissistic people often expect your identity to remain attached to their presence. They expect your confidence to weaken without their validation. They expect your happiness to collapse once they withdraw affection or attention. But healing becomes revolutionary when you learn to build a life that no longer depends on being emotionally chosen by those who failed to value you properly. And perhaps the most meaningful transformation is this: the inner places that once carried pain begin carrying wisdom instead. The same heart that tolerated disrespect learns discernment. The same voice that once trembled while defending itself learns calm confidence. The same spirit that once chased love through self-sacrifice learns that real love never asks you to abandon yourself in the first place. You stop seeing yourself as damaged beyond repair. You begin seeing yourself as someone returning home after being lost for too long. And in those sacred inner spaces they never truly owned, you create something stronger than revenge, stronger than bitterness, stronger than resentment. You create peace, and peace is something no manipulative person can control once you discover it within yourself. There is a deep sadness that comes from spending years trying to explain your heart to someone determined to misread it. You repeat yourself with honesty. You open your soul carefully. You speak with patience, hoping that if you choose gentler words, calmer tones, or better timing, they will finally understand your intentions. But instead of clarity, you find yourself trapped in endless cycles of confusion. Your words are twisted, your emotions are dismissed, your truth is questioned until even you begin doubting your own reality. And without realizing it, your life slowly becomes centered around one exhausting goal: convincing someone to see you fairly. What makes this pain so heavy is that compassionate people naturally believe understanding can heal relationships. They believe honesty creates connection. So when misunderstanding continues, they blame themselves first. They think perhaps they were too emotional, too sensitive, too demanding, or not clear enough. They carry the burden of fixing communication, while the other person continues benefiting from confusion. Because confusion keeps you emotionally occupied. Confusion keeps you explaining, defending, proving, and chasing. And as long as you remain trapped in that cycle, your energy remains focused on earning understanding instead of protecting your peace. Some people misunderstand you accidentally, but others misunderstand you strategically. They ignore your intentions because acknowledging your truth would require accountability from them. It would require them to admit the hurt they caused, the manipulation they used, or the imbalance they created. And for people who survive by protecting their own ego, misunderstanding becomes a shield. If they distort your words, they avoid responsibility. If they question your emotions, they maintain control. If they keep you emotionally desperate to explain yourself, they remain at the center of your mental and emotional world. There comes a moment in healing when you finally recognize this pattern. You realize you have been standing before a locked door, knocking with sincerity, while the other person intentionally refuses to open it. And that realization hurts because human beings naturally long to be seen accurately by those they love. We want our pain acknowledged. We want our intentions respected. We want our hearts handled with fairness. But not everyone is emotionally willing to offer that kind of honesty.